58,000 American soldiers died in a war that officially began because of an attack that never happened. Not exaggerated, not misunderstood. Never happened. And the agency that knew the truth first, the National Security Agency, sat on the proof for over 40 years. This is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the lie that started the Vietnam War. August 2nd, 1964. This part is real. The USS Maddox, an American destroyer, was gathering signals intelligence in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked it. Shots were fired. Nobody disputes this happened. But here's what gets left out of the simple version. The Maddox wasn't just sailing by, it was running a spy mission, a DeSoto patrol, gathering radar and communications intelligence along North Vietnam's coastline. Timed to coincide with covert raids that South Vietnamese commandos, backed and directed by the United States, were carrying out against North Vietnamese coastal targets under a program called Opland 34A. Just 2 nights before the Maddox was attacked, those commandos had struck North Vietnamese islands nearby. From Hanoi's side of things, this looked exactly like what it partly was. American-backed aggression, right off their coast, with an American warship conveniently gathering intelligence nearby. The August 2nd attack didn't come from nowhere. 2 days later, everything changed. On the night of August 4th, the Maddox and a second destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported they were under attack again. Torpedoes in the water, radar contacts closing in, sonar operators calling out threats in real time. President Lyndon Johnson went on national television, ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam. Within days, asked Congress for the authority to escalate American involvement in Vietnam without ever formally declaring war. Congress said yes. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed almost unanimously. It became the legal foundation for everything that followed. Hundreds of thousands of American troops, years of bombing campaigns, a war that would eventually kill 58,000 Americans and an estimated 3 million Vietnamese. All of it resting on the events of one night. Here's the problem. That second attack never happened. Not was exaggerated. Not might have been smaller than reported. According to declassified intelligence, there were no North Vietnamese boats in the water that night at all. No torpedoes, no enemy vessels closing in, just 2 American destroyers sailing in darkness and stormy weather, on edge after already being attacked 2 nights earlier, firing at targets that were never actually there. So what did the crew of the Maddox actually see? Bad weather, radar reflections off wave patterns during a storm, sonar operators who had never dealt with this kind of high-stress, high-adrenaline situation before, misreading the ship's own propeller noise and rudder movements as incoming torpedoes. Reports came in over the radio faster than anyone could verify them, each one feeding the next. Until a chaotic, confusing night at sea hardened into a confident story of a coordinated enemy attack. Hours after the alleged attack, one officer aboard the Maddox radioed a chilling message. Freak weather effects on radar and over-eager sonar operators may have accounted for many reports. No actual sightings, but Washington had already decided what story it wanted to tell. For decades, this was just a suspicion. Historians doubted the second attack. Journalists doubted it. Even some officials privately doubted it at the time. But doubt isn't proof. And the actual intelligence behind the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution stayed buried in classified vaults for over 40 years. Then, starting in 2005, the National Security Agency began declassifying documents. Nearly 200 of them. Phone transcripts, signals intelligence reports, internal chronologies written by the very people who had processed the intelligence in real time. An NSA historian named Robert Hanyok got access to the full record. Not just the cherry-picked reports that had been shown to Congress and military investigators back in 1964. The complete, unredacted intelligence trail, including radio intercepts that had never been examined together before. His conclusion was direct. There was no attack on August 4th. And the evidence suggests officials didn't just misread bad data, they actively selected the intelligence that supported the story they wanted and buried the intelligence that didn't. Hanyok's own report used a phrase that stuck with historians afterward. The intelligence had been made to fit the claim, not the other way around. Here's where it gets even more damning. A taped phone call from weeks after the resolution passed, released decades later, captured Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara privately telling President Johnson he had doubts about whether the August 4th attack had actually occurred, privately doubting it. Publicly, McNamara continued defending the official story to Congress and the American people for years. In 1995, McNamara finally got the answer directly. He traveled to Vietnam and met with Vo Nguyen Giap, the former North Vietnamese defense minister who had commanded their forces during the war. Now, sitting across from the American who had once ordered bombs dropped on his country. McNamara asked him straight, "What happened in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 4th, 1964? Giap's answer, "Absolutely nothing." 2 words from the man on the other side of the war, closing a 40-year mystery for the man who had helped start it. McNamara later confirmed all of this publicly himself in the 2003 documentary The Fog of War, admitting on camera that there was no attack that night. So why did any of this happen, if the intelligence was this shaky? Because Washington, in August of 1964, wanted a reason. Tensions with North Vietnam had already been building through months of covert raids and provocations on both sides. President Johnson was facing a re-election campaign that fall, and pressure to look tough on communism without looking like he was rushing the country into a full war. A murky, chaotic, middle-of-the-night report of an attack at sea was exactly the kind of ambiguous event that could be shaped into whatever story was needed. Nobody had to fabricate evidence from scratch. They just had to pick the version of a confusing night that pointed toward the war they already wanted to escalate, and quietly set aside the version that didn't. That's the uncomfortable part of the story. It wasn't one villain lying to the world, it was an entire system. Intelligence officers under pressure to confirm what their commanders expected. Officials eager for a clear justification. A president who needed a decisive moment. All quietly agreeing on the version of events that was easiest to act on, true or not. The consequences weren't abstract. American involvement in Vietnam expanded dramatically in the months that followed the resolution. What had been a limited advisory presence became a full-scale war that would last another decade. Over 500,000 American troops at its peak. Years of sustained bombing campaigns across North and South Vietnam. 58,220 American service members never came home. Estimates of Vietnamese military and civilian deaths run past 3 million. All of it resting on an attack that never happened. The cover-up wasn't just about that one night. For over 25 years, officials denied any wrongdoing, insisting the intelligence had simply been unclear, not deliberately shaped. It took the declassification of nearly 200 documents, decades of Freedom of Information Act requests, and historians who refused to let the question die before the full picture finally came out. By the time it did, most of the men in that decision-making chain were already dead. Nobody was held accountable. The war they started based on an event that never happened had already reshaped a generation. You were probably taught a clean version of this in school. A timeline, a date, a resolution, a war. But the real story is messier. It always is. The Gulf of Tonkin isn't really about radar errors or bad weather or jumpy sonar operators. It's about what happens when the people in power already know what they want to do, and a confusing night at sea gives them the excuse they were waiting for. The official story and the actual story split apart the moment nobody outside a classified vault was allowed to check the difference. And by the time the truth came out, it was 40 years too late.